Hey everyone, thanks for hanging in here this week as we dive into the life and the theology of Martin Luther, one of the most important figures in the Christian tradition, especially in recent history. Martin Luther is a force that we cannot ignore when it comes to the Christian tradition, the founder of the Protestant Reformation and a major theological voice in the tradition. So here we go. Let's dive in, shall we? Luther was born pretty early on in what is basically known as kind of the Reformation era. 1483 to 1546 are his dates. And his birth essentially marks this kind of turning point from what we generally think of as the medieval period into the modern era. And he is one of the voices, one of the names that tends to be associated on a pretty regular basis with that transition. And so Martin Luther is one of the first modern theologians that we're actually going to study in this course. Like we've probably heard, he was a Catholic monk, and that matters um, because as a monk, as a Roman Catholic, he was actually a good Roman Catholic. He never wanted to be anything other than a Roman Catholic. Part of the reason why is because I don't think Luther could have even imagined of such a thing. It's like there was the church, and he was a member of the church. And so there wasn't anything like we would think of today in terms of denominations. Luther really did get the ball rolling in a lot of ways on that. So he never really intended to start a religious revolution as much as he wanted to reform the Catholic Church from within. So when we hear about him like nailing the 95 Theses to the door of the chapel in Wittenberg, or when we think about him, kind of railing against the church, because there are these like larger than life concepts or ideas about him railing against the church. Keep in mind that I don't think he was ever trying to do this to start his own church. That's a very kind of Protestant thing. But he is a good Catholic, so he wants to remain in the church that he knows and simply bring reform from within. That's going to be important to try to understand Luther in a lot of ways. So, a little bit of background and history as to where he comes from and why he is the way that he is. We have to understand that the church in the day that Luther is living is deeply enmeshed with the state. In today's society, we wouldn't really consider that to be a reality, especially in the United States, that there is this deep kind of conviction among American folk that generally wants to put a separation between the church and the state. But this is not going to be the case in the time that Luther was living. A lot of times there were going to be political appointments made by the church to the state. So, in other words, like the church had some political power and authority to be able to appoint certain people in various positions, like mayor or magistrate or something along those lines. And at the same time, you would have like the mayor of a province or some kind of political authority who would, in some sense, have a strong voice into appointing church officials. So there is no strong separation, which means that you basically have for example, like a mayor who would say, like, well, my nephew needs a job, and you know what? I think he's going to become a priest. Like, we're going to have the power to appoint him as a priest and give him a job, a position to be in. Now, that is always going to be a little bit problematic, mainly because as you have officials who are appointing people as priests, those priests may or may not have the kind of theological training that is actually necessary to be the priest. So you have, different kinds of folks who are in this for all kinds of different reasons. It may not necessarily be because they have this like deep call in their life to 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 serve the church, but it is because that they had this political appointment. And this is where we begin to wrestle with the notion of indulgences. Okay, now why? Well, in order to understand indulgences, we have to go back and understand what penance is. So here's the basic notion. This all comes out of the kind of Catholic teaching on confession and penance. For the Roman Catholic tradition, you might have something like someone coming to confession and they've confessed their sins. And the priest oftentimes will give them a prescription of penance. So the way that we would hear this today is that you would pray this many times, pray the rosary this many times, pray this many Hail Marys. Um, and the common, I think, misconception about this is that you can somehow earn a pass or earn forgiveness for a particular sin that you have committed by doing these particular acts. But in fact, the the reality here, the theological reality underlying confession and penance, is that the priest really would see himself more as a doctor who is there to treat an illness or a disease, and the penance is really a spiritual formation prescription that is designed to give the person who is coming to confess a way to break that habit. So, for example, if someone comes and says, "I have a real problem with stealing. I'm coming to confess that I have stolen from so and so, and I continue to want to steal, and I steal all the time." The idea here would be that you give them a set of practices to take the place of stealing, or to not even critique, but in some sense to break the back of a habit that might be gripping our lives. So it really is kind of a prescription. But if you've got folks who are now in positions in the church who don't have that kind of theological training and are missing the point in some ways on what on what a penance is, then it becomes really easy really quickly to then begin to use this power and this position in the church for different kinds of purposes. So rather than seeing yourself as giving someone spiritual guidance or a way to break the back of a habit that may be doing great spiritual damage to them, they now see themselves as having just this power and not really quite having the theological wisdom to know what to do with that power. So this is where indulgences begin to come online. You have a whole group of priests who are now starting to do things like say, listen, I know that you have sinned, and it's a really bad sin. What I would normally say is that you have to go do this act of penance, whether it be pray this prayer or go on this kind of pilgrimage journey or something along those lines. But if you would be willing to just make a small contribution, to the church and to its ministry, then I would be willing to kind of like wave my priestly wand and kind of get you off the hook with God. Now, that, of course, is a misunderstanding of what confession and penance was for. So it's not that confession and penance are bad in and of themselves. It is the misunderstanding of confession and penance that really presents a problem. When the priests themselves are misunderstanding what confession and penance are for, now you have a real problem. And this is where Martin Luther is absolutely floored, that he's got a whole group of like priests who don't understand that that this is taking place. So you have Luther getting pretty frustrated with people saying like, or with his priests and saying to them, you ought to know better. You ought to know that this is not for the gain of your ministry or to get money out of people, and you ought to know that there is no magic wand that you can wave. You ought to know that this isn't about you kind of like exercising your priestly power over someone, and there is no like magical thing that can be pronounced that will quote unquote get them off the hook with God. These practices of penance are really there for their spiritual edification and for their growth, and those need to remain in place. So don't try to sell them short by providing an indulgence. The way that I tend to think about this is like when my parents for a while were going to a chiropractor. I think it was like every Wednesday they would go for a couple hours, and they had this standing appointment on Wednesday afternoons at 2 o'clock or something along those lines. So I remember coming to visit them, and we get there at like Wednesday at noon, and Wednesday at 2, they said, well, it's great to have you here, but we're going to go to our chiropractic appointment because we can't miss it. Every week we go. And so I don't remember what they paid for it, but like they would pay every time they would have a visit. And indulgences were kind of like if you go to a chiropractor and let's say the chiropractor could like work you over and move all of your joints and do all the things that chiropractors need to do to realign you. And that's kind of a painful, uncomfortable process. I don't think my parents loved to go just to get readjusted, they liked the effects of it. Like they were after the kind of relative health benefits that are there as part of that adjustment process. So let's say they get adjusted and then they leave, and the receptionist at the front says, okay, that's going to be, $50 or whatever it's going to be. They pay that. And essentially what they're doing is getting the health benefits of that. But if they were to go to that chiropractor and the chiropractor says, listen, I could adjust you. We could spend some time together today. I could do all the adjustments. It would take probably about an hour or so. I'd do all the things that kind of make you uncomfortable. Or you could just leave here today and not go through all that discomfort and still pay the $50. Would you do it? I think most of us would look at that chiropractor and say, like, are you out of your mind? Like, I'm not going to pay you money if I'm not going to get the benefits of what it is that you are here to do. And in many ways, that's what an indulgence was. It was a kind of misunderstanding of the purpose of penance, which is to form that person's habits away from a life of sin and toward a life in God. And in that way, then, you had priests who were basically saying, like, look, you just pay and you don't have to go through all the discomfort. We'll kind of like wave a mystical wand, a magic wand, and make it right with God. And that is what sets Luther off. Luther goes, this has never been the point. That's a misunderstanding. So let's be sure that we're not following their lead. So you have indulgences. You have this notion that a priest would prescribe a practice of penance, and that this practice is designed to form us away from sinful behaviors. Therefore, an indulgence is simply money given for less penance. And Luther is saying, like, well, this doesn't make sense practically, of course, right? It doesn't make sense practically, but it also doesn't make sense theologically, right? He has some significant theological hangups with this as well. Now, part of what we read in Plaker is that indulgences are also going to have this linkage with this doctrine of purgatory. So once priests essentially opened the door to indulgences, it really wasn't a very long step to be able to say, now look, if you want to pay a little bit more money, we can still wave that kind of priestly magical wand and get your loved ones out of purgatory. So purgatory, in kind of the tradition, was seen as that place that was kind of like the netherland between heaven and hell. And so sometimes you might have people who are trapped in purgatory after they die. And it's like, if you really want grandma to get out of purgatory, then there's the donation box, and we'll say a special prayer. So, the ball gets rolling with indulgences. It kind of morphs into this notion of purgatory, where you could contribute even more money and get grandma out of purgatory, so to speak. And this is what Luther is primarily rejecting. This is primarily what he's reacting against. He rejects it on theological grounds because he wants to say that there's nothing that we can do to earn our salvation. Luther's a good Catholic, so he's a good Augustinian. Remember Augustine, that salvation is grace. It is all grace, and that there is no works that are associated with this. And what Luther's detecting here is that these uneducated priests, these priests who have not been formed correctly when it comes to even Christian theology, are really creating a theological error by saying that there's something you can do to gain salvation, that there's something you can do to kind of like, there's something you can pay to earn these things. There's nothing we can do to earn our salvation, Luther says, because he's a good Augustinian. Remember, for Augustine, salvation is entirely a gift from God, and that there is nothing that we can do to help ourselves. Salvation is a gift precisely because we cannot earn it for ourselves. It is a gift because we can't earn it. It is given to us, and we receive it with gratitude. So this is how Luther begins his process, his protest against the Roman Catholic Church. And this is what drives him then to suggest that we only ought to trust what we find in Scripture. One of the rallying cries of the Reformers is this Latin phrase, sola scriptura, which means Scripture alone. rather than the decrees of the popes or the councils. And Luther's concern here is that the popes and the councils are potentially prone to error. They're potentially prone to being corrupted, so that you might actually have priests and popes and church authorities who are making these decrees that are perpetuating the theological error that is taking place in the church of things like indulgences and all these kinds of other things. So Luther wants to say, look, if we're going to measure or put our hope in anything, it probably ought not to be in something that that a church leader has created. We probably need to suggest, and even probably more strongly than that for Luther, that the only thing that we can trust in for kind of a dictate is Scripture, because Scripture is the only thing that has kind of been breathed by God, inspired by the Spirit, in the way that it has. So the second rallying cry of the Reformers is that our salvation is by faith alone. Sola fide is the Latin that Luther uses there. And it is simply in this reality that we trust in what God has already done to earn our salvation. Now, what does this mean? If you remember, we talked about this earlier in the course, that justification is a big deal in Luther's soteriology. So what is justification? Justification is the legal change in status that basically says there's nothing really that changes about you, but there is a change in the title that has been bestowed on you, that has been imputed upon you. We've talked about this kind of like an honorary doctorate, so to speak. You might have the title of doctor bestowed upon you, which in an honorary capacity doesn't necessarily mean that you've done the research to be called doctor, but it's a title that has been given to you even though you don't necessarily possess the knowledge of someone who has gone to study for a doctorate. So in that capacity, salvation through faith is what Luther basically says, like, you have to trust in that there's nothing in you, like there's nothing that changes in you. The trust that you have is in what God has already done to cover you up and give you that title of justified. So in other words, to go back to our honorary doctorate example here, God has done everything that God needs to do to bestow that title upon you. You do nothing for it. All you do is trust that God has done what needed to be done. In other words, there's kind of an objective reality here, and that objective reality has nothing to do with you and me. That objective reality has everything to do with what God has done in Jesus Christ, that God has given the sacrifice, has done what needs to be done, and we simply place ourselves under that objective sacrifice of Jesus Christ crucified and resurrected, and say, thanks be to God that God has done everything that we need to do to be saved. There's nothing that I'm going to do. There's nothing that I can do to earn this. It's already taken place, and I'm going to trust in the reality that has already taken place. I'll trust my entire life, my eternal salvation, to this notion that everything that has needed to be done has been done. I am secure in the knowledge that God has done what God needs to do to effect my salvation. Therefore, faith is not necessarily something that is just kind of like magical for Luther. It's more than that. It is that faith is simply placing our trust in the objective reality in God. It's not necessarily having all of the answers. It's not necessarily having this kind of even like deep-seated conviction, as much as it is simply saying, I trust that God has done everything that God needs to do in Jesus, and that's going to be good enough. In other words, I can't raise my hand high enough. I can't, be morally good enough for God to recognize me and notice me and offer me salvation. I simply trust that everything God needs to do, God has already done. We trust in faith. We trust through faith what God has done in Jesus. God has done everything that we need, and so we stand by faith in that reality. And that's faith for Luther. He's simply saying, like, it doesn't mean having all of these answers and having this kind of like unshaken conviction, about all of the details of Christian theology. It simply has to do with the fact that we recognize God has objectively done everything that we need to do, everything that needs to be done, and we just place ourselves in that reality. So this is Luther's major rallying cry, one of the largest protests that he registers against his native tradition. Now, Luther was not the first person to have these ideas. I think that sometimes is often a misunderstanding. Sometimes we think like Luther got the whole ball rolling, but actually there were many other people in Luther's day who were doing very similar kinds of things. The difference for Luther is that he actually had some political covering. If you read it in Plaker's work, there was some political maneuvering where he actually had the political cover from some friends, because the other people who were registering these kinds of protests usually ended up not living very long. The state or the church or the mechanism would kind of come up against them, and they would usually go down to their demise. So the real difference with Martin Luther is that he simply had the opportunity, by virtue of having the political cover, to not get him executed or at least thrown in prison. So these others who had these similar theological ideas really begin to coalesce with Luther. Like, there are lots of other people who start to hear what he's doing. The printing press is now starting to come online. His ideas can be disseminated more widely. Therefore, other people who have similar ideas are now able to hear what Luther is doing and to begin communicating. I mean, there's no social media in the day, obviously. The 95 Theses nailed to the chapel wall was kind of like the first Facebook post, public post, that just didn't get a lot of likes. But it did get some likes, and so this is the way that people begin to start finding one another. So Luther gets a little political traction, he gets a little PR traction in terms of the printing press, and then it opens up lots of conversations about how the church ought to be reformed. So what we're going to talk about now is the conversations between Luther and other people who are sympathetic to what he's up to. They really like what he's doing in terms of his work to renew the church. The question is how they go about this, and if the church is going to be reformed, if the church is going to be renewed, how ought that occur? Like, what should take place to make sure that the church is a new creation or has been renewed according to what is right and what is good? So, the first of these conversations is with someone named Erasmus. We're not going to spend a ton of time with Erasmus, but this revisits a much earlier theological controversy that we've encountered before. Erasmus was an interesting figure. He loved what Luther was doing on indulgences. He also disagreed that indulgences were going to be a problem that needed to be addressed. But Erasmus was the kind of person who said, we don't need indulgences because we actually have the ability in our will to just try harder. So you don't need all of that kind of like external stuff. You have the ability to choose for yourself, and to progress toward holiness and Christ-likeness on your own. And if this sounds familiar, which I hope it does, and maybe the name Pelagius is coming online in your mind, that this sounds like we are setting up another battle between Augustine and Pelagius, and this is a very similar kind of situation here, where Luther is going to occupy Augustine's territory and Erasmus is going to occupy Pelagius's territory. And in some sense, they're going to rehash this debate to say, is there anything in our will, in our humanity, or anything about us that is capable of moving us toward deeper levels of faithfulness? So again, they both agree, get rid of indulgences. Indulgences are not doing any favors. The question is why? So obviously, Luther is not going to be a fan of this. Luther does not love this notion that we can simply try harder. Our trying is in vain, because salvation for Luther is only God's doing. Remember, you just simply trust that God has already done everything that needs to be done. God is the one who acts. God is the one who does. Salvation is God's gift to us. So we aren't earning this. There's nothing that we can do. That we can't try hard enough because we are too broken as sinful beings. Augustine really affected Erasmus. I'm sorry, really affected Luther, and was very kind of formative in his theological anthropology and his soteriology. So obviously he's going to be occupying those kinds of positions. So it sets up this great debate between the will and the grace. Luther is going to say it is by grace that you are saved through faith. It is by grace that you are saved through faith. There's nothing you can do to earn it. You simply, by grace, by God's grace, the gift of God's grace, then place yourself objectively in a place of trust to say, I trust that God has done everything that needs to be done for the sake of salvation. The will is Erasmus's territory, and he basically says, no, we can will ourselves to be better people. And they obviously disagree on this point. The question is, like, where do you come down on this? This debate is, I think, still being had in a lot of sectors of the Christian tradition. What kind of a person are you on this? Are you a will person, or are you a grace person? Are you more like Erasmus, or are you more with Luther? If you have the opportunity, like in all of your free time, to read this collection of letters that goes back and forth between Erasmus and Luther, they've been published under this title, The Bondage of the Will. And it really is just a collection of letters that they're exchanging back and forth, which are actually pretty stinking funny, because Luther has this incredibly self-deprecating quick wit, where he's kind of making fun of Erasmus without even like Erasmus knowing it to some degree. It's like Luther has the kind of wit that he could kind of like, you know, knife you in the back, and you wouldn't even know that it had been done, because he's kind of like deprecating himself but also undoing your argument. And so that's the kind of dynamic that emerges between Erasmus and Luther. But this point here is that Erasmus is saying it is our free will that can move us toward or I should say, move us away from the need for indulgences. It's not that a priest can kind of prescribe anything to you, because your will is adequate to be able to move beyond this. Luther, though, says, like, look, your will is so deeply mired in sin. The doctrine of original sin is so deep and so pervasive and so real. The image of God has been so destroyed in you that there's nothing left. Your will is always in bondage to sin. Therefore, the only hope that you have is to trust in what God has done for you, because there's nothing that you would be able to do for yourself. So this is a massive part of the church tradition, and the question is, where do you come down on this? Where would you like to sign your name if each of these were offering you a kind of contract to join their team? The second conversation that I think is more important for our purposes is the conversation that takes place between Luther and Zwingli, because this really shapes the way that we think about things like communion and the sacraments. We're going to pause here for just a second. I'm going to pick up this because we're running out of time on this program, and so we're going to give you the second video of this when we come back. So you can discontinue this video and pick it up on the second video.